In July 2014, a new magazine began sweeping the world. Called a reel of slick graphics by the September 16, 2014 Washington Post, this magazine was originally published in English, but quickly expanded to French, German, and Dutch in later issues, and it promises to expand into other language in future editions. Its name is Dabiq, and it is published by, of all people, the Islamic State, otherwise known as ISIL or ISIS. Aimed at potential Western Muslim recruits for the organization, the magazine is primarily an attempt to demonstrate the Islamic State's legitimacy, both political and religious. Considering that Ila Lupin of the Council on Foreign Relations writes on September 10, 2014, that understanding the allure of this message is critical to understanding the incredible success of the Islamic State's recruiting strategies, it is necessary that we thoroughly analyze the rhetoric of this magazine. To gain a deeper understanding of Dabiq, we will first apply Burke's theory of identification. Then we will examine its context in the rhetoric of future shock, before finally drawing some implications of what Al Jazeera of June 20th, 2014 calls ISIL's attempt to remake its brand on the internet. When considering the rhetoric around Dabiq, it is impossible to not notice that the Islamic State preferred to create its magazine in English and French rather than Arabic. This is clearly an attempt to recruit Western Muslims to its cause. Considering this, we will first analyze Dabiq with reference to Burke's theory of identification. In his seminal 1969 book, A Rhetoric of Motives, Kenneth Burke lays out his theory of identification, in which he says that persuasion is fundamentally an attempt to cause the audience to identify with the speaker. He says this can be done through consubstantiation, or arguing that the speaker and audience are substantially the same, with similar goals, interests, and motivations. Dabiq's circulation, both physical and online, is primarily among Western, affluent Muslims who are used to stable governments, able to provide a variety of services to its populations. The previously cited Al Jazeera article describes the magazine as slick by any media standards, using crisp images and pithy, tweetable pullout text comparable to any other high-end magazine and conforming to Western standards of presentation. It further details how the magazine focuses on the services it provides to civilians. Dabiq's first issue includes an interview with the head of the Office of Consumer Protection, who describes his office as protecting consumers by investigating the goods sold in shops, marketplaces, and shopping centers. The third issue describes at length the Islamic State's efforts to protect shepherds and farmers from, of all things, theft. These elements work in unison to describe and demonstrate that ISIL is a modern nation state, one that Western Muslims could identify with, thus fulfilling Burke's theory of identification. Dabiq clearly represents an attempt by ISIL to recruit Western Muslims to its cause. But to truly understand these messages, it's critical that we understand them within the greater historical context of political Islam, and then apply that context to the rhetoric of future shock. First, it is important to understand the somewhat unique relationship Islam has with sovereignty. William Shepard writes in his 2009 book, Introducing Islam, that at first all Muslims resided in the Arab Peninsula, in one political unit. At first held by the Prophet Muhammad himself, leadership of the Muslim people fell to Khalifas, political successors to the Prophet. This caliphate stood for some decades, but eventually fell into different political units as Islam spread to very diverse societies and the caliphs proved difficult, even impossible, to prove legitimate. The previously cited article for the Council on Foreign Relations notes that the Islamic State attempts to call back to this golden era by insisting first on an Islamic State that is universal to all Muslims, especially those in the Arab world, as the Caliphate once was, and second, by even portraying its leader as a Khalifa. Next, we need to understand how Dabiq's constant reference to the future interacts with the rhetoric of future shock. Albert Lewis writes for The Communicator in 1975 that future shock is the confusion and anxiety created in those who are faced with rhetoric demanding intense adaptation or change. The Islamic State is careful in its message to avoid this kind of rhetoric, instead appealing to the stability and certainty of the Islamic State's eventual victory and prosperity, with headlines such as "Trade flourishes under the rule of the Islamic State" in its second issue, and "The Islamic State humiliates Maliki's Safawi army" in its third. Even its acts of violence, which it by no means attempts to hide, are demonstrated to be ultimately aspects of stability and inevitable success. The Pacific Standard of September 17th discusses that the name of the magazine is also very deliberate. Dabiq is the site where the Prophet Muhammad predicted that the forces of good would ultimately triumph over evil in a battle in the wake of the end of the world. By framing any uncertainties in the context of a certain eschatological victory, the Islamic State is attempting to avoid future shock as it places itself within the larger narrative of the history of Islam. Now that we've seen that the Islamic State's rhetoric in Dabiq is attempting to create a state that Westerners can identify with, and that this state fits within their larger narrative of the history of Islam, we can draw two major implications. First, that the Islamic State is justifying violence to Western Muslims to portray itself as legitimate. And second, that this could alter how the West views Islam and Muslims. First, in ISIL's attempt to appear legitimate, in its bid to remake the Islamic world in its image, supplanting the largely secular nationalist states that have long since replaced the caliphate is a key goal for the Islamic State in order to appear as actually legitimate. It cannot do this, however, without first justifying the frequent violence it commits. ISIL is able to do just this through Dabiq, as Burke's theory of identification shows that this is fundamentally an attempt to cause Western Muslims to identify it with itself and its use of violence. By being keenly aware of the rhetoric of future shock, it is able to prevent these individuals from fearing drastic changes coming forward, but instead reassures them that their advancement is both natural and necessary. It comes down to the Islamic State attempting to appear legitimate in the Muslim world and recruiting Western Muslims to its cause. And while rhetoric can't strictly make claims about effects, the New York Times on November 23, 2014 indicates that it seems to be working. Next, in using Burkean identification and avoiding future shock rhetoric, Dabiq legitimizes violent extremism as not only normal, but essential for Islam. The Arab Spring of 2011 saw largely peaceful protests against harsh, violent autocrats and marked many Westerners looking at the Arab world anew with new sympathy and understanding. However, if this Dabiq's message is as successful as its creators hope it will be at attracting and persuading the global Muslim community, it could set back how the West views Islam by decades, if not centuries. Considering that CNN reports on December 3, 2014, that both the US and Europe are at a tipping point between acceptance and Islamophobia, it is disconcerting to say the least that most Westerners may soon be hearing a voice of Islam split between peaceful, kind, community-focused Muslims and those who insist that jihad is essential for life itself, and we have to ask ourselves, which voice will they be listening to? Today, we've examined Dabiq and how it employs the rhetoric of Burke's identification, and then we've seen how it manipulates its place in history through the rhetoric of future shock. After examining the context of these strategies, we drew implications. It is not yet evident how all the issues surrounding the Islamic State will ultimately play out. It is obvious, however, that Dabiq will certainly play a part.